Hello students, welcome to our latest update program. In this video, we will discuss the increasing trade deficit in India, particularly for the month of October. So we'll see what are the possible reasons behind this trade deficit and which sectors have been the worst hit. So if we look at the trade deficit situation of India, particularly October saw a huge surge. So the trade deficit in October 2025 that increased by 141%, that is $21.8 billion, which means that if you compare the trade deficit of October 2024 to the trade deficit of October 2025, there's an increase of 141%. So the trade deficit situation in India is alarming at the moment, and it is very important for any country to balance the trade deficit, because an increase in the trade deficit can lead to an increase in the current account deficit, which is not a desirable situation for any country. That is why it becomes very important for every country to balance the trade deficit. So what do you understand by trade deficit first? Trade deficit is a situation wherein a country is spending more in comparison to what it is generating. So the imports for a country have increased, but the exports have gone down. So a simple analogy, when you spend more than what you generate, than what you receive, you are in a deficit situation. Same thing for a country. When a country is spending more in buying something, that is the import. It is spending more in buying something in comparison to the revenue that it is generating by selling something, that is the export. Then it is a deficit situation for that country, because you're spending more than what you are generating. So we are in a trade deficit. And the exact opposite of this is trade surplus, where we are generating more revenue in comparison to what we are spending, which means we are exporting more in comparison to what we are importing. In that situation, we are in a trade surplus. Right now, we are in trade deficit. So what are some scenarios in which a country will be in a trade deficit? There are two main scenarios. The first one is very simple. When the imports increase and the exports decrease. In comparison to the previous year's data, our imports have increased and our exports have decreased. Individually, if you look at these sectors, the sectors that are involved in both these categories, so individually the exports have gone down in comparison to the previous year's data and the imports have increased. In that situation, we'll be in a trade deficit. Now there's a second situation also. Can you think of that? So the second situation is that when the imports have increased and the exports also have increased. So both the imports and exports have increased, which means that the sectors in the export area also, in the export category also, they have also increased. They're performing good, they're performing well in comparison to the previous year's data. So previously, if we were exporting less, now we're exporting more. Even in that situation, even when the exports have gone up, we can be in a trade deficit situation when our imports have increased more. So there's a relative increase, relative difference over here. Imports have also increased, exports have also increased, but the exports have increased less in comparison to the imports. Imports have increased more and the exports have not increased that much. They have increased, but not that much. Even in this situation, there will be a deficit. This is a more obvious situation, but this is also one situation in which there will be a trade deficit where both imports and exports have increased, but the imports have increased more than the exports. And right now, India is facing a trade deficit because of this, where our imports have increased and our exports have decreased in comparison to the previous year's data. So if we look at the data over here for exports, the total exports in October 2025 shrank 0.7% to $72.9 billion. And not all exports saw a decline. Please note that there are two types of exports: the merchandise export and the service export. So our merchandise export saw a decline. Service export, on the other hand, that increased. So there was a shrinkage in the merchandise exports which fell by 11.8% to $34.4 billion, and service exports on the other hand, that increased by 11.9%. So service export kind of provided us a resilience in the export category, but overall the exports fell down and the imports increased. That is why right now India is in a trade deficit. So there are two scenarios over here, import and exports. We'll cover both of them, but we'll first start with the export sector. What is happening in the export sector? Why did it decline, and which sectors have been impacted the most? So the exports overall declined for India, and there are a lot of reasons for that. First, there are global disruptions that we see. Global disruptions in the supply chain because of the war-like situation that is prevalent in a lot of regions. So there's that. And secondly, there is also the tariff that has been imposed by US. So there's a 50% tariff that has been imposed on Indian goods, and Indian merchandise is facing a significant decline. The exports are facing a significant decline because of that also. Earlier there was a 25% reciprocal duty, and then there was a 25% penalty that was imposed on India because we were buying Russian oil. So overall it was 50%, and because of this also the export sector is majorly hit. And here we are talking more about the labor intensive sectors, because these sectors are already working on a very small margin, on a very thin profit margin. So any disruption, any duty that is imposed in these sectors, these people have to pay a high price. These MSME sectors, they have to pay a huge price, because now our goods will not be as competitive to the goods that are coming from Bangladesh, that are coming from Vietnam. So our goods are not going to be as cheap in comparison to those goods. That is why these sectors, particularly the merchandise sectors that we're talking about here, the labor intensive sectors, they are going to see a huge hit. And that is what happened with India's export sector also. We see some sectors that have seen a significant decline. So we have the leather and leather products, which declined by 15.7%, gems and jewelry by 29.5%, organic inorganic chemicals by 21%, engineering goods by 16.7%, cotton yarn 13.3%, man-made yarn 11.8%, and jute 27.8%. So all these sectors were significantly hit because A, there were global disruptions, and B, there's also a tariff that was imposed by the US, and US is our top export destination. So any disruption in the US market is going to hit our exporters. That is what happened here also. Though India is taking measures right now, there are talks, there are bilateral negotiations that are happening between India and USA. Nothing has been materialized as of now, but there are talks that are happening. And India is also looking at diversifying the options so as to bring in resilience in the supply chain. But please understand that these things are going to take time. Changes do not happen overnight. So we cannot just keep finding alternate export destinations in a matter of time. This will take some time. So we are already moving in that direction, but right now these tariffs, they are hitting us, they are hitting the export sector, and the global disruptions are also hitting the export sector. But a way to move forward here is that what we are doing at the moment, A, is building self-resilience, relying more on our domestic industries, and B is diversifying our options, not relying only on one or two major economies, but diversifying our options so that if there's any disruption that happens in these economies, we are not this badly affected. So our exports have declined majorly because of these reasons, and these are the labor intensive sectors that have seen the most impact over here. And secondly, our imports have increased. Imports have also significantly increased, and here some major things, the major areas where we see this increase are the gold and silver import. We're talking about the month of October, which was the month of festivals. We saw a lot of demand for gold and silver in the Indian markets, and that is why also our gold silver imports increased. We had to import from outside. So understand there are two situations, okay, for the imports to increase. First, if the demand has increased, naturally if there's an increase in demand, you'll have to import more. So then again our imports are going to go up. There's a second situation also, where the demand has not increased, the domestic demand is the same, then what's happened? The demand is the same, but global prices have increased. Now you will be paying more for the same quantity that you needed. Last year also you needed the same quantity, this year also you needed the same quantity, but because the global prices have increased, even if your domestic demand has remained the same, you will have to pay more. So the imports are going to increase. In this situation also in October, both the things happened over here. So there was a demand rise also because it was a season of festivals. There was a huge demand in the Indian markets for gold and silver. So our demand increased, and then in turn our gold and silver imports increased. So imports have increased because of this, and then the crude oil import also saw an increase. So majorly we are in a trade deficit situation because our exports have gone down and our imports have gone up, and in imports also particularly we're talking about the gold and silver imports and the crude oil imports. Though this situation is expected to cool down in November and December, right now we're analyzing what happened in October because October saw a huge trade deficit. So this is what's happening in India's scenario at the moment. Our trade deficit is on the rise, but we'll have to cool things down. We'll have to balance it out so that our current account deficit does not increase, because that's not a desirable situation. So that was all for this video. I hope you were able to analyze the whole situation holistically. Now, as always, let us practice a question for prelims. With reference to India's recent trade trends, consider the following statements. 1. A fall in India's exports of engineering goods, pharmaceuticals and textiles directly contributes to widening the merchandise trade deficit. 2. Higher US tariffs on Indian goods affect India's service exports more than its goods exports. 3. An increase in global gold prices can widen India's current account deficit even if domestic demand for gold remains unchanged. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? A. 1 only, B. 1 and 3 only, C. 2 only, or D. 2 and 3 only. Please attempt this question and provide your answers in the comment section. Thank you for watching.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.